Wine Time Fridays, another uncomfortable detail of the Downing Street social scene uncorked by the papers today. The Mirror saying staff bought a fridge to store booze in to see in the weekend with, that the Prime Minister encouraged them to blow off steam, that they do a Tesco run with a wheelie suitcase to replenish supplies. But it's news of the two parties the night before Prince Philip's funeral last year that have incurred the wrath of Conservative heartlands the most. Despite rules against indoor mixing, there were reports of a basement disco, late-night drinking in the garden, and someone even drunkenly breaking a swing. Allegations Number 10 do not deny. The volley of embarrassing detail leaking from the building behind me has been met with a now well-worn slogan: await the outcome of Sue Gray's investigation. The senior civil servant has been speaking to present and past members of staff to get an idea of what's been going on. But we understand that she too was blindsided by news of these two parties, reading about them in the newspapers. Her investigation was supposed to report at the end of next week, but we understand that deadline's now being moved for her to look into this new information. And if this is the case, all this raises questions about the level of transparency she's been met with. Number 10 apologised to the Queen for those two parties, but in many formerly loyal quarters, the damage has already been done.
You have got to be honest. You've got to show that you are following the rules everyone else is. You've got to have integrity. And if you don't have that, for me, that breaks trust.
Should Boris Johnson resign?
That's an issue for him. It's an issue for him to go and think about the integrity that he wants to demonstrate and how he can address this issue.
And what if Sue Gray's investigation comes back and she finds that rules were broken?
I think at that point, I think his position probably would be untenable, and I suspect the party would act.
A poll this week showed that Labour is now 10 points ahead of the Conservatives at 42%. That's the largest lead the party has had since 2013. And 7 in 10 said in the wake of what's now being called Partygate, Boris Johnson should resign. So it isn't really about the brilliance of Keir Starmer, actually. It's about how people are reacting to Boris Johnson.
I don't think it's necessarily people being very pro-Labour or very pro-Keir Starmer, but they're now so anti-Conservative, it is building up this Labour lead. Even in our latest poll, we found that it wasn't so much the hosting of the parties, it's the cover-up. And therefore, I think if the government had maybe even got ahead of this story a little bit or owned up to their mistakes, I don't think they'd necessarily be in the pickle that they're in now.
It's now in the national interest that he goes, so it's very important now that the Tory party does what it needs to do and gets rid of him.
Internal skirmishes are written into Labour's DNA, but today they're basking in the electoral warmth of Tory discontent. I am the anti-Boris was Keir Starmer's pitch, one that's landed neatly with Number 10 now so often on the defence. Last night, one newspaper even reported the PM had labelled their redemption strategy Operation Save Big Dog, though this they strenuously deny.
Well, earlier I spoke to Claire Purcell, a former special advisor at the Home Office, who's now a Conservative councillor in Kent. I asked her if a culture of parties and drinking was something that she recognised from her time in government.
Well, it certainly didn't when I was at the Home Office. And in the 18 months I was there, I think we maybe had drinks on 3 occasions. Of course, we were not in the middle of a pandemic. These were after work, after a particularly hard day. And it was one drink and we went home. So it certainly wasn't a party atmosphere, no.
So if the report compiled by Sue Gray says there was a culture of drinking, which is in itself quite shocking, but if that were to somehow exonerate certain individuals, what would your response be to that?
Well, it depends who the individuals being exonerated are. Now, the last thing I want to see are junior members of staff being thrown under the bus. It has to be senior management that takes the can for this. They are responsible. They should lead by example.
Are you talking about the Prime Minister here?
He is the man at the top. It really does rest with him.
Sue Gray seems to be used here like the sort of Fifth Amendment at the moment, doesn't she? Everyone is waiting for Sue Gray to rule on just about everything. But her remit is quite limited, isn't it? She cannot be judge and jury in this.
No, that's right. She will produce a report, and she is a very, very thorough individual, and she will produce a factual report, but it won't contain any opinion, which, she's not there to do that. It is then up to members of Parliament to decide what happens from that stage onwards.
What impression are you getting from the emotions triggered by this amongst the grassroots?
There is enormous anger and disappointment at the behaviour of people in Number 10 at a time when we were all looking after residents in our local communities and the vulnerable and abiding by the rules, and those people who missed out on seeing their loved ones for the last time or attending the birth of a child. I think this is really going to damage the party, and my heart goes out to those people. Some of the stories I've heard are just so sad.
There's a lot of rage here, but there's also quite a lot of ridicule. And it's the combination of these two R words that is particularly dangerous to this government, isn't it?
It is. And unfortunately, in a social media age, that is what we're now seeing. Something which is a very serious situation is being turned into a joke. So you have to question the authority of the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office, which seems to have now gone downhill rapidly.
Do you think the Prime Minister can ride this out?
I don't think he can. I think this has now gone on for too long. There have been too many revelations, and you wake up every morning thinking, when is the next one coming? And unfortunately, I think it will be, next week, and it will combine with Sue Gray's report.
Claire Pestall, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, until a general election, the people who would or could decide the fate of the Prime Minister are, of course, Tory MPs. Most of them have gone to ground. Peter Bone hasn't. He's the Conservative MP for Wellingborough, and I'm glad to say that he's joining us. I salute your courage, Peter Bone, for coming on the airwaves. You've been talking to your constituents all day. What are you hearing on the doorstep?
Well, every Saturday, we have what's called our listening campaign. We have a meeting at 9 o'clock in the morning. Today, there was 42 activists there, and the vast, vast majority were supportive of the Prime Minister and the government. But they were, of course, Conservative activists, so you probably expect that. But the key thing is we don't go and knock on doors. So a 2-hour stint in the morning, and then after lunch, another 2 hours stint. I think there were 7 teams out. I was out with Tom Perscoff MP and Councillor Helen Harrison, and we were knocking in a Conservative area, a very heavily Conservative area. There's an election on, we are actually asked, will they go support our candidate or not? And the really interesting thing was there was huge support for the Conservatives and for the Prime Minister. And I didn't have a single person say, I don't like the Prime Minister and I'm not going to vote Conservative again, though I voted in the past. There were people that didn't like the Prime Minister, but they always disliked the Prime Minister and never voted Conservative. So it was very interesting.
So there's a lot of solid support in your constituency, you're saying. There's a lot of solid support for him still in your constituency. But I just wonder what you make of some of the details, if I may, that are coming out. I mean, this report, for instance, that staffers had to put chairs in front of his door to prevent him from leaving, rather like a child's gate. The Operation Save Big Dog, which I know Downing Street have denied, but there are people inside who say, actually, that is what it's being called. This is all very silly, isn't it? It's making us into a bit of a laughingstock.
Well, there was a number of comments that were made on the doorstep relating to what should happen. And one of them touches on what you've just said. A gentleman I had a quite lengthy conversation with, he says, look, Boris is a great communicator, a bit like Ronald Reagan, but he needs to have people in Downing Street who are, well, how does he put it, older, get rid of the 25-year-olds who seem to be, out of control. And that's what he needed to do. That's what this gentleman said. You need to clear out the people.
But the culture, I know, but the culture of Downing Street is set by the man at the top, and the man at the top is called Boris Johnson.
Well, I think that the culture in Downing Street is normally looked after by the people who run Downing Street. And largely that's the senior staff, which of course, when most of this was going on, was a chap called Dominic Cummings, who's been completely discredited. But I mean, that was just one of the comments made.
Are you letting the Prime Minister off the hook completely for these parties?
Well, certainly, some of the parties referred to clearly he didn't know anything about and certainly wasn't in attendance. But another comment was made on the doorstep. Well, let's wait and see what the independent report says. So I'm only telling you what my constituents have said to me on the doorstep. This isn't part of the Twitter sphere, and it's not part of the media bubble, and it's not part of the Westminster bubble. Was I surprised when I got back to my constituency to the reaction? Yes, because I live in the Westminster bubble and thought everybody was just talking about that. In fact, another comment on the doorstep was, Prime Minister. What we want the Prime Minister to do is actually cut taxes. We'd rather get rid of they want to get rid of the tax that's coming in next year.
Well, that's the other point. There's tax rises coming up in April. But just briefly, very briefly, the polls have got him consistently, your party, 10 points behind Labour. At what stage do you get worried, like some of your colleagues, about the numbers just not adding up and you possibly losing your seat?
Well, I don't worry about polls, but what I do worry about is what my constituents say. And it's a shame that Channel 4 wasn't following us around today, because you might have had to report on a different picture than what you are presenting.
But you've given us that picture.
I can only tell you what my constituents said. I would have told you the absolute truth, and that's what they're telling me. So they do not reflect, I have to say, rightly, they do not reflect what you say the opinion polls say. They don't.
Finally and briefly, one-word answer. Has he lost his moral authority, yes or no?
No, and he'll lead us into the next general election.